Welcome back to Best Pod Available. Today we're continuing on our contender series where we break down the rosters of the best teams in college football. Today we're doing Texas Tech. No Brennan Sorsby, which changes the perspective for their offensive ceiling, which we'll talk about. Will Hammond's still very talented. We'll get to him. Ryan, let's start with the offense here for the Texas Tech Red Raiders because they're bringing back some unheralded pieces, especially at running back, especially with Quentin Joyner. Yeah. And they also have one of the better offensive lines that you're going to find on a Big 12 team. What's the first thing that you really like about with this Texas Tech roster?
Well, I think you hit on it. It's the running back room for me because I think all the attention is obviously going to be served to the quarterback positions, which we'll dive deeper into. But I do think that a great way to supplement some questions at the quarterback position is a strong running game. And I think that Texas Tech, in terms of just your top three running backs, Joe, SEC, Big Ten, wherever you want to go to, this is maybe the best three deep at running back in college football. Because I'm thinking like Oregon comparatively with like Jordan Davison and Dyer Hill, which I think is a dynamic running back unit. And there's a couple others that have really a good two-man punch at the running back position. But how many running back units can you say Cameron Dickey, Jacoby Williams, and not to mention Quentin Joyner, who I was a huge fan of last offseason before his injury? Either one of those guys could be the quote-unquote bell cow of the group, and they could function as a high-volume ball carrier if they get that opportunity, if everybody's fully healthy. So this running back unit, I think, is the perfect thing for this year's Texas Tech team to have. Because we'll talk about the wide receiver. I think there's wide receiver talent. I like the offensive line. I think Will Hammond's going to be a lot better than maybe some people give him credit for. But I do think this conversation starts with the running back room. Because if there's any questions at all about what your passing game is going to be, you can just hand the football off to three different guys in the backfield and make big plays.
Well, and the big piece here that I think makes the running back room extra dynamic is that Quentin Joyner's coming back from the injury. You just talked about Joyner there. He was a guy that you and I were really hyped up on last preseason when he transferred over from USC. His film was unbelievable. And then there was this kind of like build up and excitement from us and from the draft community for what he could just be as a lead running back in an offense and as a possible early day 2 draft pick. The preseason injury was devastating, and while it didn't affect Texas Tech offensively that much because it allowed for them to find Cameron Dickey and Jacoby Williams, their roles and what they can mean for this team, I really do wonder, does Joyner just fall into a tertiary role or just in the rotation, or do we get that explosive running back that we saw at USC that was misutilized by Lincoln Riley? Do we see that? Does he emerge as the lead guy? Do we get that same conversation? I think if that happens, that takes a lot off the shoulders of Will Hammond playing behind a pretty good offensive line for Big 12 standards and also in the country. They got one of the more experienced offensive lines and just more solid units in college football. Not many like premier big name prospects, but when you've got that offensive line with Quentin Joyner as maybe the lead back, the sky is the limit for the rushing production that they could produce.
Well, and I'm interested, not to get like too deep into like X's and O weeds of this conversation, but when you have three running backs like this, I'm also interested if we see some like 21 personnel stuff at times where it's like we need to get two different running backs on the field and not obviously your traditional like I formation with the fullback, but I'm talking about like there would be some really interesting components of like, what if we got Dickey and we got Williams on the field at the same time? Or what if we got Williams and Joyner on the field at the same time? Because they all bring, I think, different skill sets, and I think that's what makes a room dynamic potentially is to have diversity to it, right? Like Dickey's kind of that shorter back that kind of hides behind the line of scrimmage and is patient. Jacoby's a little bit more of like your downhill physical dude. But then Joyner, if you remember Joyner at USC in 2024, Joe, because they had Woody Marks at that point, so they didn't need him to be the full-time ball carrier. They would like put him into the slot. They'd give him reverses. They would direct snap it to him at times. Like he was a very he was kind of like that gadgety type of player for the USC offense. So I'm interested to see if he's fully healthy, if he becomes kind of your do-it-all weapon where you throw him the football, where you let him split out wide at times, where you do some trick stuff to him to be able to utilize his ability in space. So I like that diversity a lot, and I really think that is going to be the intriguing part, is how much of an offensive shift we see this schematically this year now that you have 3 different versatile weapons in the backfield. It's interesting.
So they brought in Kenny Johnson from Pitt, who was almost a 700-yard receiver a year ago. Coy Eakin comes back, who was a 600-yard guy. They also added Dante Lee Jr., Malcolm Simmons, Jalen Jones. But one of the bigger wild cards is Micah Hudson, who, for those that might remember, if you're a Texas Tech fan, you know a lot about Micah Hudson. If you're a general college football fan just trying to learn about teams, he was a highly recruited 5-star that picked Texas Tech, shocked a lot of people, had a bit of a weird back and forth, went to Texas A&M for a minute, came back, hasn't really done a whole lot production-wise, but we all know is supremely gifted and could be a 1,000-yard receiver. We're yet to see it.
Right.
I think that Hudson's interesting to keep an eye on, and I wonder if this could be his year now that he's been a part of the program for a more consistent stretch.
Oh, you stole a little bit of my thunder, Joe. I was hoping that you wouldn't even talk about Micah Hudson because, like, I don't know if it's a hot take. I guess it could be because, I mean, you look at Johnson coming over from Pittsburgh. He's a good player, but he's a little bit more of what I would call like a floor setter. Like, you want just kind of proven production in the room. Eakin is a good, like, downfield, outside contested catch type of guy. Like, he has good hands through contact and all that type of stuff. But I really do think that if healthy and if he's locked in, for lack of a better phrasing, I think that Micah Hudson is going to be the breakout star for this team. Because I was actually watching some of the offensive tackles recently for Texas Tech, and I forget what game I was watching, but Micah Hudson made a number one, made a couple flash plays in the game where I was like, all right, man, there's that 5-star, right? Because I remember watching him out of high school. He's Jeremiah Smith's class. I thought he was going to be Odell Beckham. Like, that's who he looked like to me, like movement-wise, springiness, explosiveness. So I am all in on Micah Hudson breakout season if he is fully connected. Like, if he's locked in, if he has tunnel vision, I am in there. But I do not want to undersell Joe. I know we're talking wide receivers and potential breakouts, but we also can't forget about Terrence Carter Jr. into this conversation as well, because he was one of the more productive tight ends in college football. And he's extremely interesting because we talk about making a quarterback's life easier. Having a tight end who is a yak monster, a guy who can really dominate after the catch, like, that's something that Carter brings to the table in a big way.
Carter is pretty under-recognized in the landscape of college football for tight ends. For some reason, not a lot of people know who the best tight ends are, just generally, and I think that Carter has proven to be productive, having had a 600-yard season at Louisiana, having 600 yards a year ago for Texas Tech. This now all comes together for what do we expect from Will Hammond. I know that there has been some narrative, I guess narrative's the word I'm looking for, that maybe Kirk Francis could fill in where needed and could start the year if necessary. I always find it funny when you're in crisis mode, you know, the PR machine works in a way that, you know, you saw some articles like they're really high on Kirk Francis. So I think that they're hoping deeply that they don't have to turn to Kirk Francis as an option at quarterback. But here's the thing with Will Hammond that I believe is maybe misunderstood. He is more physically gifted than Bear Morton, and equally as physically gifted as Brennan Sorsby. The difference was that Sorsby was further along and played a lot more football. He was a lot more developed. He had just started to hit his stride as a playmaker, and he was ready to impact right away. Hammond was coming off the injury, so it made more sense for Texas Tech to go into the portal, spend the money on the big-name guy with the roster that they had to see if they could win an actual national championship. I don't know if if they're capable of winning a national championship with Will Hammond, because there's still growth that needs to happen for him as a player, but he's got a pretty live arm. He moves pretty well. If he comes back from that injury, I don't know how long that's going to take, but if he comes back, he could still have a solid year and a better one than what Morton had.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I I'm not quite ready to say that he's as talented as Sorsby physically, but I will say this, Joe. I had posted right after the Sorsby stuff happened that I think that people are underselling what Will Hammond can do in this offense. I think that he is a very talented quarterback. I remember seeing him. He was a true freshman, and he came into a game. I forget what game it was, towards the end of his, I guess it was the 2024 season, and I thought that his arm was live, man. Like, he's got a live arm. I think he can move well. I mean, he averaged like 7 yards a carry last year in limited opportunities. So, like, he is a physically talented kid. The problem with the situation more than the starter for me, because, you know, we can have the debate of Sorsby versus Hammond. What's the fallout in terms of like how much of a downgrade is Hammond from Sorsby? We can have the conversation if you want, but more the intrigue and the troubling factor, I think, for Texas Tech, as you mentioned Kirk Francis. I'll also throw in they have a young quarterback that I remember as a high school recruit, Lloyd Jones, who's a really dynamic athlete. But the problem now is you have a quarterback who's already coming back from an injury. And the question now turns to, before it was, if God forbid something happens to Sorsby, we have Will Hammond coming back from injury, who's a very talented quarterback. If something happens to Will Hammond, then you're like, snap, we're in a little bit of trouble here. I think that your floor falls out a little bit more now if there is an injury, God forbid, at the quarterback position. But I agree with you, in a vacuum, I think Will Hammond, as long as he can stay healthy, is going to be a good player for Texas Tech, and I think he's more than going to be able to keep this ship afloat and for them to potentially win the Big 12 and make another playoff run. I just am a little bit worried about a quarterback coming off of injury and seeing just kind of unsettled assets behind him, if that makes sense.
There is a potential there for there to be some rust, and it doesn't help that they play a team like Houston early. So if he's not as mobile, that's one of the, I understand that Hammond's got a live arm, and the arm talent is what makes him dangerous as a player, but he moves pretty well. He's not a crazy dynamic runner or anything, but in modern college football, being able to move and navigate the pocket for a guy like Hammond, I wonder if coming off the knee injury, how much that holds him back. Does that affect his confidence? He also missed out on one of the biggest opportunities for him, which is having the offseason to improve with on-field reps during the spring and summer workouts and all that stuff. So what type of growth do we get from him from that little brief stretch that we saw from him? Because you mentioned the times where he did step in and he looked awesome. He did have periods of time where you saw the floor, you saw the shakiness. Which version of Will Hammond shows up, I think, is going to be critical for them winning the Big 12 again and for them getting to the playoff and actually winning a game this year.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, he controls the ceiling and the floor now of this room, and it's unsettling because he's going to be a little volatile. Like I said, I think that he's going to be good, but the fact that injuries are involved and he still is just a redshirt sophomore quarterback who has only started a couple games in his career, I mean, those things will all lead you to falling to that floor at times of worry. I do think, again, kind of circling back the conversation, because we didn't talk too much about the offensive line, but the wide receivers, I think, are very talented. I think the running back room is deep and one of the better ones in college football. And you also do have a very veteran offensive line in front of you. Like, I liked the Jacob Ponton kid at right tackle a ton on film. You have Howard Sampson, who started a lot of football now at left tackle between North Carolina and Texas Tech. You have Sheridan Wilson, who's one of the better college centers around. You have Hunter Zambrano, who's played a ton of football. And then you got Jordan Church in the transfer portal, who's played a good amount of football as well. So, like, you have a veteran-laden offensive line and a lot of playmakers where I feel better about the floor of Hammond as a player not falling to it too often. But I understand there is still going to be some question marks there because you just don't have a huge sample size of a proof of concept when it comes to Hammond as a starting quarterback in college football.
Now, defensively, they got a lot of dudes. Yep. They brought in a lot of transfer portal players in the trenches, and that's where they've found the most success because they've done a really good job of evaluating and then also being in the ballpark of being able to pull some of the best trench players in the portal every single year. Like Adam Trick was a guy that top programs were going after, the kid from Miami of Ohio. Mateen Igbaragba was a defensive tackle that many of the top programs wanted. They return A.J. Holmes. Austin Romaine is a part of this linebacking core. There are a lot of players that are above the typical talent level that you see in a front seven in the Big 12. And that was how they won last year, and a big potential reason why they win this upcoming year.
I agree. So I know we've talked about this a ton, Joe. I'm typically against rebuilding trenches via the transfer portal unless you're in a conference like the Big 12. Like if a SEC school or a Big 10 school was consistently doing it this way, I would be just firmly against it. But the fact that you saw what they did in the Big 12 last year after getting David Bailey in the transfer portal and getting Lee Hunter in the transfer portal, I think that they are always just going to kind of be this team that's going to run the Big 12 more often than not, and because they can be able to get some of the better players via the transfer portal. So you mentioned Adam Trick. I don't think Trick's a great pro prospect. Like I don't think he has the upside of like a David Bailey or even a Romello Height from last year. But I think that he is a very good college defensive end, and he will be a good player in that system. And I feel the same way about Trey White. Like Trey White is not a flashy player from San Diego State, but he has been incredibly productive during his career. So it's going to look different. Like last year, the Texas Tech defensive ends, they were explosive, and they screamed off the edge. These guys are going to be more nuance and hustle and efforts. Like it's going to look a little different, but it's still going to maintain production. Like I think that that's going to be a productive unit. I am very excited about this defensive line coaching, defensive staff for Texas Tech to get their hands on Mateen Igbaragba, because that's the one guy that I look at here. He is, you know, it's funny, Joe. I feel like they got a couple high floor players. Like I consider Adam Trick a high floor player. I consider Trey White a high floor player. You know what they've been. They've been productive. Mateen Igbaragba had some production last year, but he is much more like upside play of a player because I don't think that he is near to his ceiling. He was a FCS defensive end at Georgetown. First year at Wake Forest in 2024, he was a backup. And then last year was his first year starting, and he's finally now up to around 300 pounds. This kid is still developing physically, which I think is interesting. I'm excited about Igbaragba because I think Holmes is a floor setter. Trey White is a floor setter. Adam Trick's a floor setter. But if there's anybody in this group that ends up being a top 50 selection because they just take this massive step forward, I think that it's Mateen Igbaragba on this defensive line that has the most to gain and the highest ceiling to potentially touch this year for Texas Tech.
Yeah, Igbaragba is kind of the David Bailey of the group, where he's not necessarily going to be top 3 pick, but the guy with the traits and the tools that the coaching staff works with the supporting cast around him, that he explodes and his talent emerges and he becomes one of the best defensive tackles in college football. They have had a lot of recent success with the development of defensive linemen. Lee Hunter was phenomenal. I mean, A.J. Holmes is also a really, really good player who they have developed, and he returned for this upcoming year. On top of this, two of the more notable names on the back end, Ben Roberts, loose fourth cousin of Ryan Roberts, is in the linebacking core. He kind of looks like you. And then Bryce Pollock at corner is an all-conference player as well, who's long and pretty consistent. Made a couple of pretty big plays in coverage for the Red Raiders in 2025.
Yeah, Ben Roberts unfortunately does play like me a little bit too much as well. Unfortunate for him. Obviously, that's a joke, but he's a very, like, I mean, him and Romaine are a little bit similar. Like, they're different body types, and I think Roberts is more impactful in pass coverage. But I think that both players, Joe, like, it's interesting. Last year, you had Lee Hunter, who was a just horse up front. Like, he could take up so much space. This year, you're a lot more. I know Bryce Butler is a decently big kid. I think he's like 320 pounds. But you have A.J. Holmes and Igbaragba, who are both more of gap shooters. Like, they want to create negatives behind the line of scrimmage. And when you have that type of style in front of you, more often than not, you're going to need to be a little bit more physical on the second level, and both those kids are downhill players. Like Roberts, Romaine, extremely downhill. You could even throw John Curry into the conversation, who plays the star position, but like in certain situations, he's basically just going to be a Sam linebacker. Like that's the position he plays. All three of those guys are very similar in the sense of they're aggressive, they're downhill, they're physical, they want to stop the run. So I think that is needed on this team. A little bit more explosive on the interior this year, but a little bit more not great run defense in the interior as well. So I think you need those linebackers to be able to fill those gaps quite literally. So I think that is needed. I love that you mentioned Bryce Pollock. I feel like nobody talks about Bryce Pollock because he's not flashy in terms of like, he's not a sexy athlete like Leonard Moore. He's not a sexy athlete like Ellis Robinson. Like, he's not like this guy that's going to go to the combine and run 4.3 and do all these types of things, right? Like, he's not that player, but he is probably the best zone corner in college football. Like, his ability to jump short passing windows, create turnovers, and seemingly just always be in the right spot. Bryce Pollock is extremely savvy, extremely nuanced, and he's one of, you know what's weird is like this, Mississippi State has quietly done a really good job of producing corners recently, and do you know that he actually began his career at Mississippi State too? Like, I feel like we talked about Kelly Jones a lot this offseason a lot, but they had, what was his name that was drafted by the Commanders a couple years ago in the top
Emmanuel
15?
Forbes.
Emmanuel Forbes. And then they had the other kid that went to the Cleveland Browns a couple years ago as well, Martin Emerson. So they've had Emerson, they've had Forbes, they've had Jones, and they also had Pollock, who was on the Mississippi State team as well at one point. So Mississippi State quietly did a pretty good job of developing cornerbacks, at least on the college level, to become draft picks, and I think Pollock's going to be another draft pick. Not a sexy, explosive athlete, but just an incredibly good, heady football player who has a propensity for always be around the football.
To give a verdict on expectations for what this team can do this upcoming year, I think that they win the Big 12 again. I think that BYU will be bridging the gap, and I think that the Big 12 championship game will be much closer, and it'll be a lot more competitive because they're bringing back a lot of experience, especially defensively, and I think that Bachmeier is only going to get better. I think that LJ Martin is going to continue to produce at a high level, and the separation comes from the fact that what we just talked about there. The offensive line is the best in the conference. The defensive line is the best in the conference. The front seven is the best in the conference. When you have those two things at the top of your conference, you would need to be disastrously bad at one position like quarterback or whatever it might be to lose your conference. But with that being said, I do think that there's challenges for them with the distractions of the offseason and trying to get into a rhythm with Hammond, with him knocking off the rust, that they're probably not going to go on much of a run in the college football playoff. I feel like that there are limitations to what they're capable of, sadly, once again. If they want to dip all the way in and go full steam ahead for 2027, that could be the year for them. But because of everything that they went through, I feel like it does leave them in a hair of an unsettled state with a limited amount of time to get all of those distractions out of the way and to get fully prepared for the upcoming season.
You know what's a shame, Joe, is last year, I think we texted about it at the time, but when they played Oregon in the college football playoff, I had said something like, imagine if they had Brendan Sorsby in that game, right? Like, they had a window there. I don't think, obviously, they beat Indiana or even beat Miami in the playoffs whenever they get to those teams, but they had an opportunity, I think, to win a couple playoff games last year, depending on how things kind of shook out at the quarterback position. I just think they were a little bit short, which is so funny that Barry Morton ended up getting drafted. Like, it's pretty funny to think back at, because I just think he was fine. Like, he was just a good, solid college quarterback. You needed dynamic last year, and you just did not have dynamic at the quarterback position, and it faltered in the biggest game. This year, I think that they will be in the Big 12 championship game. I actually have gone back and forth on this team almost every day. There's some days where I'm like, all right, I feel like I'm drinking the Will Hammond Kool-Aid, where I'm just like, okay, I think they're going to win the Big 12, and I think they'll make the playoffs, obviously. But I have question marks other days where I'm just like, this feels like a team whose floor is a little scary to me if one or two injuries happen. And obviously we can't predict injuries, but that stuff does scare me in terms of understanding a team's ceiling versus their floor. So I'm going to say that they make the Big 12 championship game, but I'm not certain that they win the Big 12 championship game. If they don't win the Big 12 championship game, they don't make the college football playoffs more often than not, right? So I'm going to say that this is a Big 12 contending team that can win the Big 12 championship, but I'm actually not as sold that they should be the favorite today as I once was.
All right, we'll see what happens. Hit the like button on this video, folks. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content during this college football season. We'll talk to you later.